Good afternoon, everyone. May I please ask you to take your seats, those of you who are still coming in. My name is Hanna-Mari Kilpeläinen, and my task today is to make sure that this session starts on time. So please help me by proceeding to your seats. Please come in. There's still room here in the front. Lots of seats available. Thank you. So indeed, a very good afternoon, and welcome to session 3 of today's Global Forum. The hot topic of this session is public-private dialogue in support of better national policies and the SDGs. And first, I'd just like to remind you of a practical detail for this session. So simultaneous translation is available, English-French and French-English. So please do remember this. It's there to help you follow the discussion if needed. Welcome. Please find seats. There's still room up here in the front. And now it's my pleasure to immediately, without further ado, introduce our moderator for this session today, Ms. Julie Gichuru, founder and chief executive officer of Arimus Media Limited. Julie is an entrepreneur and media personality, journalist and news anchor from Kenya. Julie, a very warm welcome to you. We're delighted to have you today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. We hope to have an engaging discussion this afternoon. We're going to be tweeting, I'm sure you've been doing it all day, but just a reminder on hashtag OECDGFD. So please do share what's happening in this room this afternoon with the rest of the world. So I host a show called Africa Leadership Dialogues, and I love to share African wisdom. So we're going to kick this off with an African proverb that goes, by the time the fool has learned the game, the players have dispersed. Now, the fact is, we cannot do this anymore. As we heard this morning, we need a common agenda and a common mandate, and we must move together. And therein lies the greatest challenge. The how, and we really want lessons shared this afternoon, a call to action that we can all use and adopt in our different spaces. We have an incredible panel with us. They're going to enrich the conversation. In no particular order, let me introduce them. Malin Ripa is Senior Vice President of Volvo Group. Thomas Lösler is Head of Group Compliance from Allianz. Martin Short is the CEO of The Power of Nutrition and former Managing Director of Lions Health Global Partner and UBS. Andrew Mitchell is a former UK Secretary of State for International Development and is a Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom. Ulises Canchola Gutierrez is Director General for Economic Relations at AMEXCID in Mexico. And Vitalice Meja is Executive Director of Reality of Aid in Africa. So we have a good mix as well of private sector, development world, and public sector experience seated here. To get us started, as I said, we're looking at the how. How do we identify practical next steps to encourage governments, businesses, civil society to leverage their resources and help achieve the SDGs agenda? For this, we need stronger national businesses, that is certain. We need investments that create shared benefit. We need a good, strong regulatory framework, and we need checks and balances. I want to start with a question to Malin. As Senior Vice President, Malin, on corporate social responsibility at Volvo, which is known for leadership in driving progress in development, please share with us a few examples that Volvo has learned over the years from engaging successfully in partnerships with developing countries and development partners.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting us to this important meeting. First, let me just give a brief introduction to what we actually are doing. And a couple of years back, we have a strategic challenge within the Volvo Group saying that we want to grow our business in Africa. And how should we actually achieve this? We realize that there are obstacles. We are not really present in those emerging markets where the growth will happen. So we started to understand what is the challenge for us. And we realized that the skills, the skilled mechanics, the skilled drivers, that is really a challenge for us. So we took it to our core business, looking at what is the obstacles for growth and for the company growth in Africa. And we suddenly realized that there are other actors focusing and want to achieve the same vision. And that was SIDA and USAID. They wanted to create decent jobs, to create economic growth and development in those countries. So what we first did was to create a common understanding, a common vision about, let's establish 10 schools, 10 vocational training schools in 10 different countries in Africa. We have now been to this journey a while. We realize that we can't do it ourselves. We don't have the right contacts with the governments. We don't have the knowledge of vocational training schools in the context of those local markets. So we understood we need some partners, actually. And to be able to do this, we choose UNIDO as an implementation partner, and we work with local NGOs or organizations to actually perform the training. And I think this is now a very, very successful, from our perspective, project, because we respect each other and we understand each mutual roles into this school. We deliver different things. We, as a private company, are not into daily operations of the school. We provide equipment. We contribute with our skills on what is actually what kind of skills does a mechanic need to be competitive? What kind of training does the teachers need in order to train the students? So this is our role. While SIDA and USAID are more of donors, they have the connections with the government to actually facilitate the national recognition and get the right contacts and permits to actually do the school. And we have UNIDO, who is then an expert in industrial development, so they can then make sure that we don't disturb the market in any way. So I think this is a very unique partnership that we have. But the most important learnings is that first, start with a pilot, create a common vision, and then choose the right partners. And then from the core of what we want to achieve, scale up. For example, how can we inspire others to do the same kind of schools in other parts? How can we train our students to become entrepreneurs so they do their own workshops going forward and so on? So I think that is a first important learning from this.
Thank you. That's really instructive, Malin. Just before I leave you, I just want to prod a little bit. As a private sector player, if you were asked what the key thing you would expect from development world or development partners in terms of supporting the private sector to get more involved in development issues, what would you want from them? What would the key thing be?
I think that the most important thing is that not look upon the private sector as a funder. We want to be there with our knowledge. We want to be there with our assets in terms of products and so on. We have a knowledge and the assets actually to contribute on equal terms. And if we are allowed to actually connect it to our core business, then we will achieve a sustainable investment in this by our company. If there is only a transaction, that is one term, and then 1 + 1 will not be 3. And I think that's a very important thing that we have seen. But also another thing when it comes to the private sector involvement, there is a lot of discussion, of course, about partnership, and we need different types of partnership. But just to explain about the private sector situation, in Sweden, we have something called Swedish Leadership for Sustainable Development. It's actually a collaboration between 22 of the largest companies in Sweden. And we have then been trying to find common projects actually to work on. But it's quite difficult to find over different sectors to find common projects when we want to connect it to our core business. And the same situation occurs when we are encouraged to actually work with our competitors. There are legislations like competition law, which actually limits our possibilities to work. So I would also propose that we look in our value chain. Let us work with our suppliers, with our dealers, because then we also reach the small and medium sizes, maybe local companies as well.
Thank you, Malin. So those are really instructive. So don't look at us as an ATM machine, please. Private sector can contribute much more, including knowledge, and also let's use our supplier chain. So thank you so much for that, Thomas. I come to you now, and as Chief Compliance Officer at Allianz, you have a really strong overview of the challenges that business face when they're engaging with governments, especially with regard to compliance and integrity. So do share an example of a solution that a company like Allianz is using in ensuring compliance with often very complex regulatory environments.
Julie, thank you for having me, and also to the OECD. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak here. I would actually like to respond to Malina, but I think I'm supposed to answer your question. Maybe we can come back to that point later, because we also have a very interesting training concept where we improve the financial literacy of young students, and by doing that, improving the regulatory system in many countries. But I come back to this because I want to respond to your question. A couple of years ago, Allianz was involved in a corruption case in Indonesia, actually. And we were heavily investigating this because back then we were still listed at the New York Stock Exchange, so we were under the very strong enforcement regime of the US authorities. And once the case was settled and we got out very, very good, I had a very interesting conversation with the local regulator. And the local regulator told me, I mean, this is so widespread here, these corrupt practices, but you are the only thumb who got caught. Why were you so stupid? And we said, that's interesting. So we had a very interesting conversation, and we talked about our regulation and why we really take care of making sure that we globally are not involved into any corrupt practices. But we also realized that this may not only be the regulator, but many key people in the company and in the country who thought the same. So I talked to my own employees and my own colleagues about what they thought about this process. And this was very burdensome. We lost management, we lost compliance people, legal people, and went through a very, very hard time and tough time there. And then we realized standards may be the same, so corruption is not allowed, it's really disregarded across the globe, but the opinion and the view and the perspective of people is different. And then we started what I think is a very cool initiative. We started to involve our people, our colleagues across the globe into dialogues, into integrity dialogues, starting first with our own colleagues, our own employees, and not necessarily talking about the do's and don'ts and compliance. You can't do that and you can do that, because that's very boring for many people. But we involve them into daily dilemma situations that often are posing ethical dilemmas. And we involve them into dialogue. And this dialogue is very, very healthy, because people start talking about their values, local custom, why things may be different in certain jurisdictions compared to others. And we are now trying to transport this, and that's a tough thing to do, into the private-public dialogue sessions. And we are still looking for platforms where we can drive this forward, where we have public and private sectors sitting in the same room and talking about exactly these dilemma situations and how to deal with them. So that's the toughest thing to do.
In this space, how do you think donors can play a role? How can they support this effort?
I mean, what they actually can do is providing the platform, as I said, right? Bringing the different sectors together. And over lunch, we talked about the different silos. We are talking all the same different languages in our own world, and it's very tough to break up these silos and then at least try to speak a common language on what we mean. And if you have this platform that is more neutral, as opposed to walking in as a financial institution into a regulatory office and saying, hey, that's our view and what is yours, that's already confrontative. And if you have this dialogue platform, That makes things very easy, much easier, not very easy, but much easier. And that's what we are trying to do now with the Allianz for Integrity and other platforms that we are using and where we are more and more involved in.
Thank you so much for that. Creating a safe space for dialogue, a neutral, organized by a neutral party. Martin, I come to you now. And you have 30 years in the private sector. You've now been in the development world for quite a while. Do share specific examples, Martin, on the lessons that you have learned on how you can build successful partnerships in this space. Please.
Thank you. Normally I'm accused, by the way, when I do speak at forums like this of offending at least 50% of the people in the room. So in the interest of cooperation, I'll try to make that 75%. I think that when I from the private sector has been noted, and I think that one of the things that has been interesting for me is to actually try to think through that paradigm of how we can get the overlapping sectors of public finance and private finance together. And one of the things that I think is frustrating for me is there is a sort of an elephant in the room question, which I think the private sector should be asking and does ask, and the public sector should acknowledge as a reasonable question and think through what that answer should be. And that is, what's in it for me? And we have to get to a state where we move on from the moral imperative and think through something that actually engages the private sector on terms and conditions where they can do what they do best within the environment that they're working in. Now, these guys have got shareholders to report to. These guys have got boards to which they report, and they have got governance procedures. As you just mentioned, Julie, they're not an ATM machine, but they do have a significant amount of opportunity to add enormous amount of value. So if the public sector genuinely thinks that engagement with the private sector is not something they wish to engage upon, I would suggest they pack up, go home, and prepare for failure in terms of sustainable development goals. And if the private sector feel at the same time that they don't feel they have to engage, I suggest they pack up and go home and tell their shareholders that their stock price is going down and prepare for regulation. So am I nearly at 75%? I hope so. So I think in the interests of thinking through that collaboration, I think the private sector are the ones that are going to create the jobs. And those are the ones that have got all the capital, because there isn't enough capital in the public purse to be able to address the goals that we've all signed up to deliver upon. So there must be collaboration. Now listen, collaboration is incredibly difficult. The Power of Nutrition does not implement. I cannot tell you how many sleepless nights that gives me. I'm determined never to implement, but one of the things that most people do when they're frustrated with dialogue is actually to try to think that they can implement better than everybody else. And so they got these parallel systems running in place all over the developed world where they feel that they can do it better than somebody else. Partnership and collaboration, two things: equality and compromise. Both of those are incredibly difficult, but once you attain those goals, incredibly satisfying.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to re-emphasize the importance of understanding the value, and you've highlighted it, I believe, Martin, that private sector brings to the engagement. But let's pretend I think, that you're in a room where most people are unconvinced and think profit is a dirty word. And you're trying to convince them that private sector should be part and parcel of the development agenda anyway. We hope most people think that way, but there still are those who don't. What would your punchline be? What would you say?
There's no such thing as public money.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Delivered perfectly. I'm going to come back to the panel in just a moment, but first, I just want to get a sense of where this room is on this issue. How many of you are convinced that partnerships between development partners and private sector benefit the poor? How many of you think that partnerships between the development world and private sector benefit the poor? And if you do, please put your hand right up. Okay, what is that, 40% of the room? So 60% seem not quite convinced. Would someone like to tell us why they are not convinced? Is there anyone who, if you're not convinced, the gentleman who represents the laborers, yes, it is. Please, if we could just give him the mic for a moment. Sorry, behind you, and then I'll come to you at the front. Just behind the gentleman Okay, we can start here. Go ahead, thank you.
I work for the University of Bamako. I'm not convinced because I come from a country from Sahel. We have so many assets in Mali. We have cattle. We have 4 million heads of cattle or even more. But up until today, our parents have been carrying these bulls to Côte d'Ivoire to sell them. We never talk about the issue of meat production. We have milk, but we import billions in CFA francs of worth of milk to buy milk from abroad. We have water, but we don't have enough agricultural products. We have other produce. We have large rivers, and a country like that cannot work under such conditions. Now, as far as the independence is concerned, there is absolutely no way we can process our products. We have cotton, but we export clothing, but no processing. So I'm not convinced that these partnerships can actually bring something as of today. This is what I meant to tell you.
Okay, so they haven't been delivering so far, and so you remain skeptical. Okay, let's just take one more comment here, and then I'll come back to the audience in just a short while. Gentleman in the pink shirt. Thank you.
Thank you. Our cut is that this approach has always been identified with a dual and enclave system. That when we are talking of investment, investment has been directed to the formal sector, which is segmenting societies. And the question is, if we were so interested and so committed to the poor, why is it that the informal sector is growing? That's point number one. Yeah. Point number two, if I take from our colleague from Sweden, they are talking of trying to ensure that they capacitate their mechanics in Africa. But we are not being told as to how exactly they are doing it and which countries and for what purpose. And yesterday, I was talking to some colleagues, and they said the danger and the tragedy that we face, particularly in these platforms, is that we celebrate potential. But from a trade union perspective, we don't celebrate potential, we celebrate results.
Thank you, thank you. So very important contributions. I'm going to get a speaker from the floor to share some examples with us. Darian, I'm coming to you in just a moment. But, you know, to the panel and everybody else in this room, the first point that was made on the Mali situation, to me, represents a huge opportunity for partnership in private sector and the development world. For me, that it should present opportunity. The second issue raised, where you're talking about the formal sector, and yet the informal sector is so critical. It is growing. In many parts of our regions, informal is now literally the formal. It is what supports people. So the question perhaps is, how do we scale? And that's part of the discussion we are having this afternoon. How do we bring in the micro, small, and medium-sized companies to be part of this change? So Darian, I come to you. Thank you very much. If we could have the mic here at the front. No easy answers to some of these things, but what we really want from you is specific lessons, one or two, on mechanisms and platforms that governments, private sector, development world can use to make all this work, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm Darian Stibbe from the Partnering Initiative, and we work with governments and the development community to engage business as a partner in development. And as part of that, we've been working in a number of countries, including Zambia and Colombia and Mozambique and Singapore, to create these mechanisms, these platforms that can physically bring together the different sectors of society, bringing government together with business, including local business, including informal business, and with the UN, with donors, in order around particular development issues or particular business sustainability issues, and then to be able to actually catalyze the collaborations on the ground that will take forward both the business agenda as well as the social environmental agendas. And I think that what these mechanisms do is that they are an essential part of this whole scheme. I feel that this morning we were talking about trying to cook a pizza by putting it under a hot grill. There's all this massive amount of finance and money that's available, and it is available. This world is awash with money, that's no question. But we're just cooking the top of the pizza. We're going to have a very soggy base if we do not build what we heard about the enabling environment, if we do not build the absorptive capacity in country to actually have these sorts of investments. And these sorts of platforms on the ground are able to do that. They're able to bring together all the different sectors to be able to not only absorb investments, but also to be able to look at all the other aspects, whether they're governance or regulation or human capacity. We heard about skills development that are required if these investments are going to work. Key takeaways from this: partnering is bloody difficult. It takes a huge amount of time to bring these organizations together, and we need to cut that time down. What are we doing to cut that down? First thing, we need to change or adapt people's mindsets and understanding about the interconnectedness of the prosperity of business, prosperity of society, and prosperity of the environment. We're all in it together. We need people to understand that and be able to align and work together. Secondly, we need to have these sorts of platforms that physically bring people together. We heard this morning about trust, and that you can have trust by dialogue. No, you can't. Dialogue does not build trust. What builds trust is doing what you're saying you're going to do. It's action. It is working together and being effective together. That is what builds trust. So these platforms that help to make these partnerships happen are essential. Thirdly, organizations, governments, donors need to be better at this. They need to have the right systems and processes in place. And vitally, they need to have the right capacities in their staff in place. When we think that we can all partner, we think it's easy. Partnering requires a real skill set, a real mindset, understanding of other sectors, empathy towards others. That is something that needs to be both learned and taught, but also through experience to be gained. If we can put all of these things in place, as well as the international finance element, then we have a chance of bringing this investment down into people's lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. With that, I come back to the panel, and Andrew, I come straight to you. As former Secretary of State for International Development Corporation, you did make it a priority, and you've made it a priority to engage with the private sector. We have seen quite a bit come out of that. What I want from you now is to perhaps share with us the lessons that you have learned in that process. What can we take from your experiences and your knowledge that you've built up that we can apply across our different regions?
Well, thank you very much, Julie. Is this working? Thank you very much, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. I've come overnight from Washington, where I've been trying to make the case to the new regime for accepting the value of soft power. I have to say that this is an ongoing mission which all of us need to be engaged with.
We all want to know before you continue, how did it go?
Well, I think there's more work to be done, I think, on all of this. But in Britain over recent years, and I think many people would accept this, we've managed to refocus on the private sector. And whereas in the past, particularly on the left of politics, the private sector tended to be seen as the enemy of development, we tried to show that the private sector at its best is the engine of development, and that's what we should focus on. And of course, the private sector isn't just multinationals. As the moderator in the first session was saying at the end, more than 70% of all the jobs created worldwide are created by the private sector. And what is the key message of international development? It is that if you want to lift yourself out of grinding poverty, then the two key things you need are, one, a conflict-free environment, and secondly, the opportunity to be economically active. And the private sector, with 70% of all the jobs created by the private sector, is that specific chance. And, you know, the ability to lift yourself out of poverty around the world for millions of people, and in the international development community, we shouldn't be anything other than proud of this. We have been incredibly successful, and many, many more people are no longer living in grinding poverty than were 13, 14, 15 years ago. There's a lot more to be done, but We should also remember that for all the flows of development funding across the international exchanges, they are dwarfed by the flows of direct investment, and of course also dwarfed by remittancing, which goes on to such an extent in the poor world and is an area of untapped social benefit for which a lot more, in my view, could be done. If you ask me the second question, again, I will come on to what Britain specifically has done with its development finance institution, but the use of challenge funds, whether you are trying to plug a hole in the market, if you like, to get agriculture from Africa into developed world supermarkets, that is one very useful way in which government can use development funding to engage with the private sector for everyone's benefit. And also, of course, you can use challenge funds to plug holes in the development market, for example, getting girls into school in the most difficult places where there is no sinew of government. Again, you can use private sector funds married in through challenge funds, and we've done that in Britain. We've set up a challenge fund to engage specifically with the private sector, which should get 1 million girls into school in the most difficult parts of the world.
So it's fascinating. Andrew mentions getting girls into school. I know of a project in Kenya that was started as a development project to record the families that are sending girls from communities which traditionally marry off girls very young and get them out of school very young. It was recording the families, sending the girls to school and giving them a little bit of an incentive to do so. But that project has developed into what will become sustainable from a private sector model, which is providing to the more elite schools a curriculum online, which schools are registering for. So it's very interesting that a business has grown out of what had started off as a development project, and I think we're seeing this happen more and more. But to the skeptics in the room, all the skeptics everywhere who continue to be concerned. I know we've said there's no public funds, really, but for those who say there are public funds, and we're concerned about engagement with private sector, because how do we hold them accountable? How can we ensure that they are used for those who truly need them and are efficient? What would you say?
Well, I would say that the reforms that we've introduced to CDC, the former Commonwealth Development Corporation, which had lost its development DNA, really, in Britain, it had become a sort of city slickers operation where very large salaries were being paid for the operation of a fund of funds. And we've reformed this 100% owned government development finance institution so that it is able to take the money of the private sector, the investment of the private sector to the most difficult places and deploy and show the extent to which the private sector can really make a difference. I think, for example, of the investment that CDC is making in the Kivus, incredibly challenged, incredibly difficult. But that investment will employ local people, it will deliver valuable goods and valuable services, and it has the potential, of course, to pay tax into the exchequer. And the reason we changed CDC to make it so much more of a development institution using private funding to create jobs and economic activity was because we saw in the work of Manocap in Sierra Leone, which some people in the room may be familiar with, a body that couldn't raise investment funds from organizations like CDC, like the World Bank, and so forth, raised money from friends and relations and contacts, and then invested this money in the fishing industry. Now, the thing is extremely difficult, and it goes backwards and forwards. But effectively, what they have done, this is through the inspirational achievements of one young guy who started this up, effectively, the result that they have achieved is that 1,000 families now have an income coming in from the work of reviving the fishing industry there. And 2 years ago, they paid $750,000 into the national exchequer through tax. Now, that is a very good example of why I say the private sector is not the enemy, as so many used to think, particularly on the left. It is the engine of development. And we need the sort of cooperative approach that I thought was summed up very effectively by the moderator in the first session, and which you, Julie, are articulating so brilliantly this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I come to you now, Ulises, and the government of Mexico really does have a long history of engaging with the private sector in its development cooperation. You yourself have spearheaded the Allianz for Sustainability, a strategic platform to encourage permanent dialogue. What lessons can you share with us today from your experiences?
Thank you very much, Julie. As you may know, the Allianz for Sustainability was established just last year, and it comprises 80 to 90 both national and foreign companies. And this has been a very ambitious project. I would signal, among many others, three examples or three lessons, which I will announce as the follow. Participation of the private sector in SDG does not appear out of the blue. Second, the changing nature of the relationship between government and private sector. Third, even the changing nature of the government's participation in this dialogue. And of course, my call for action would be to follow a Socratic approach. Now, if I may just dwell quite rapidly in each of these three aspects. First, the participation of the private sector in implementing SDGs does not happen without a precedent. If you take a look at the process that we began in the 1990s, the private sector has been there all the way, not only the discussions on, I remember because I've been there, for instance, space or communications, or even in non-proliferation and the combat against chemical weapons, where the private sector really had a very active role. So it seems to me, as we've been discussing here, that we've been going all along, the private sector and the government, through parallel tracks. And we have reached a point of maturity with the SDGs, with the UN session last year. And it seems to me that we are beginning to realize, after 27 years, that we are on the same road and we need to focus on the following of the same targets. Second, from this perspective, the dialogue with the private sector has been changing in nature. During the 1990s, early 2000s, we were engaging with them in a consultative process, whereas right now we are really in an engagement mode. Namely, at least within the Alliance, we have seen that the private sector is coming forward with projects. We are not imposing an agenda, we are more directing the discussion. This brings me to the last lesson, which is the role of the government. We've been more like, that's why I was saying, like in a Socratic exercise. We are exercising meiotics. We are trying to elicit knowledge. We're not imposing an agenda. It is the private sector that is coming up with the projects, and we're just trying to catalyze the process, so to speak. So that's why when we were asked to call for action, I would say that governmental engagement in meiotics with the private sector would be the right way to go, aiming at collectively eliciting SDGs in implementation without the imposition of methods or projects.
That's very interesting, and some people would take a different point of view and encourage or really insist that government should take the lead. But in a way, you're saying, look, let's allow the private sector to do what the private sector does, create an enabling environment and really let them run with it from there. Still staying with the role Mexico has played and the learnings that you can share. As a former co-chair of the Global Partnerships for Effective Development Cooperation, Mexico has been a strong supporter of ensuring that it engages with actors across the board to make development cooperation more effective. What do you think governments need from the global partnership? How can it support this effort?
I think that the best way to support the effort is to give coherence to the effort. This morning, in the first panel, and in this panel as well, we've been talking about the different role that the private sector is playing. To me, it's like a two-track approach or two parts. First is, well, we've been talking a lot about funding, but the other one, most important, is business. I mean, I've seen in our experience that the Agenda 2030, it's already profitable. So from this perspective, no matter what the governments are going to do, we are running the risk of being left behind, because anyhow businesses are thriving on the idea of making business with the 2030 agenda. So that's a very important thing to be focused on. And when we talk about leaving nobody behind, I mean not only, of course, the poorest people, of course, the micro enterprises, but also governments themselves. We need to live up to the challenge. And from that perspective, we are trying to cope with this process that I've referred to before, the two tracks parallel running together. We need, as governments, to provide coherence to this dialogue. And at the end, we need to talk the same language with the private sector.
Thank you so much for that. Vitalice, I come to you now and for your perspective. And at the second high-level meeting that was held in Nairobi, I know that the civil society representatives there raised some serious concerns around ownership, around accountability, around transparency. And there is some concern about how private sector operates. So what do you think is required to create an effective partnership between these different stakeholders, please?
Well, first of all, and also in the context of SDGs, we must recognize that all stakeholders are relevant, including the private sector.
But do you see how he says it? All stakeholders are relevant, including the private sector.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And in that regard, we must really look at the need to change the behavior change from everybody. And the private sector should not be left out. And that's why I think that in dealing with this issue, we need to look at where are the people. And what frameworks are we putting in place to ensure that citizens indeed become at the center and indeed we are accountable to them when things fail and when they work. And I think right now we are majorly concerned about the money. No, it's about livelihood. And certainly as we design development programs or investments for that matter, we really must think about, is it about development or is it about making profit out of SDGs? I think that's the fundamental question for me. And in that regard, I think, how then do we build trust among the people? I think we build trust among the people when we involve them in the planning, when we are accountable to them, and when we set up deliberate structures to mobilize them, to bring their views into the table. And I think in that regard, we really need to think about how we set up multi-stakeholder structures that mobilizes everybody and brings them to the table. So that it's not just about international investors. No, it's also the small-scale guy, the informal person that my colleague was talking about. How do we bring them? Because at the moment, you have a scenario where they call them the round table with the president. And what they discuss there, we don't know. What the informal sector people will never get access to the president. But at the same time, we are saying that this is where 75% of the population are found. And therefore, in the context of SDGs, really, if we are thinking about resources, if we are thinking about real investment, that we must design products that attend to them. But going forward, I think, indeed, I don't want to accuse anybody, but what I see is lack of capacity. Lack of capacity from the private sector, lack of capacity from the governments, and also development partners in terms of understanding what does it mean to implement sustainable development goal beyond finances.
So a focused effort, a way forward, an action on your part, what do you think is most urgently required to bridge that capacity gap?
What is required is us to invest in training, one, and what we need also is indeed to have some policy reforms that recognize that people must be part of policy making, but that people must be at the center of planning, and indeed everybody must be accountable to their action, particularly to the citizens where they operate.
Thank you so much for that. Fascinating thoughts, and I'm going to come back to the floor in just a moment. A couple of things. If you listen to Vitalice carefully, you will hear we are on a journey to build trust. And really, we need to take the time and effort that is required to build that trust between the development world, stakeholders, private sector, public sector as well. We need to build capacity, Vitalice has also mentioned. The good news is there's a huge willingness. And that is a first step, that people are willing. So what next? I'd love to really get from those who contribute now, from the audience, the next steps. What can we do? What can OECD do? What role can it play? And different partners as well. Tell us, what can the development world do? What can governments do? And what should we expect from private sector? Let me start by coming to Tyler Gillard. Yes, Tyler is right there on standby. Directorate of Financial and Enterprise Affairs right here at OECD. He has some insights to share on the work they've been doing. And Tyler, one easy way to scale would be to engage supplier chains. So what lessons can you share on how this can be effected, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julie. An excellent panel, I must say. So yes, I work with the investment division of the OECD, and so we come at things from a bit of a different angle. We look at how do we devise policies and regimes to create predictable and transparent investment environments to attract quality investment on the one hand, but how do we also devise standards and regulations to ensure that that investment is responsible and ethical? And so we have a number of standards on responsible supply chain management in various sectors, and one of them that I'll be drawing from a couple of examples from is our work on minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and the responsibility of companies throughout that entire chain, from the mine until the consumer, to do due diligence on their supply chain and ensure that when they're sourcing from the informal sector and artisanal miners, and here, for example, you see that artisanal informal sector represents 90% of the mining workforce. Yet, large-scale mining industry dominates discussions with government. So when you're sourcing from artisanal miners, what is the responsibility to deliver those goals? Now, we see here that minimizing the negative impacts of your operations and supply chains is a core part of doing good. We talk about maximizing our positive contributions a lot, but we cannot forget that on the one hand, if you put in place training programs, but on the other hand, you have supply chains and operations that are undermining human rights or governance, that you are not going to make the progress that you deliver and that we promise to. So what we need to think about, what are the lessons that we've seen? Well, one is to shape markets and the business environments to deliver those goals. And I couldn't agree with Martin more. You know, business is not philanthropic organizations. So we need to think about the levers, including across the supply chain and using trade policy in order to deliver those goals. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we've been doing is working with the biggest metal markets and metal exchanges to ensure that any gold refiner that's delivering and trading on the Shanghai Gold Exchange or Singapore or London or Chicago has gone through a due diligence process and become audited to invest in artisanal miners and ensure that human rights and labor rights are protected. So that creates the business incentive for a refiner to source from artisanal miners, informal sector, deliver human rights benefits, and then have access to markets that they would not otherwise have access to. Another is thinking about working with the financial institutions to deliver innovative financial products that will get these things going. So another project is a work that IFC is doing with Levi's to provide global supplier trade financing at low interest rates, that those interest rates become lower and lower as the suppliers improve environmental and social performance. So that helps offset the costs of compliance with environmental and social standards. So the work that we need to do and think about is really to embed into global supply chains, which are interconnected but also completely fragmented, the incentive structures to deliver these work, but not only to make a positive impact, but also to limit the harms on human rights and labor and corruption that might be happening in the supply chain.
Thank you so much for that. Coming to the floor now, and we do have a couple of Twitter questions, but I first want to get some comments and questions from the room. Gentleman has his hand up on this end, please. There's a lady as well. Good, great. On this side, is there anyone I'm missing? Okay, we'll start with these two. Yes, and another gentleman at the front. So, yes, we can start with the lady, and then we'll pass it down. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name's Raquel Marty. I'm a philanthropic researcher. My degree's in philanthropy from Indiana University. And I'm here to see the trend that you're doing in OECD. But I'm also looking very closely because I study this field and see how the different fields interconnect. I've been seeing very closely share value out of Michael Porter. And I've seen that grow a little bit further than what corporate social responsibility that you were presenting and how it's structured into the business sector. And I recently did an article on looking into that aspect that I would gladly share. But I also feel that the field of philanthropy should be a little bit more involved, probably in the sector, because it has so much data and it has so much research about the different profiles of the relationships of the different sectors that could highly benefit. So I would gladly
your action point would be that you can share your data, first of all, but also that we get philanthropy more involved.
Yes, definitely. Philanthropy should be more involved.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
As an academic, as a field, so you can see the data and the trends.
Thank you. Gentleman behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. Michel Lavolée, Public-Private Partnerships Europe. I've been working on partnerships in development for 20 years. And I just want to suggest that we shouldn't be reinventing every time what we already discussed in the lead up to Busan, for instance. I was heavily involved in that process. And saying that there are examples in the MDGs of where partnerships actually worked. In health, I think we do have good examples of instruments that were created and produced good results, because trust is not something you just talk about. You have to create trust, and you cannot create trust if you don't sit the people at the table. You have to talk to one another, not, across conferences. And that can produce results. We did develop models that worked well that we called co-investment, where once you have a common goal, there's a business case, there's a development case, there's an NGO case to achieve a goal, then you work out a mechanism that, produces a better result. And we did that. So let's not forget what we achieved in the previous episodes, because we don't have all that, much time to reinvent everything. We need to be concrete and work together.
Thank you for that. We don't have the luxury of time. We have an ambitious agenda. If there are things that we have in place, we can already learn from them. We will take the gentleman there and then come forward to the gentleman on the second row.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Hopper. I'm in Senegal. I wear several hats, but why not the Senegal Evaluation Association? I have 3 points on the how-tos. First point is capacity. One thing we always do across the board in all situations is use poorly existing capacity. So let's just talk about capacity building, but let's really make sure we dig down in the various countries. There is always more capacity than we think, and for different reasons it's marginalized or not. And one good example on a very large scale, of course, is the informal sector, but you can go the university capacity not utilized by government. So there's a lot of capacity we need to just identify and use better. Secondly, we have to change the education systems in many countries. We've confused schooling with education. Quality has gone down. Children are learning enough to know they don't want to do what their parents did, but they don't have really any marketable skills. So there's a huge problem in many places of education systems. And thirdly, strengthen the evaluation. Not evaluation as some donor-driven exercise, but evaluation as the South Africans are doing and the Beninois and the Ugandans that are in this room, so that evaluation is part of governance. It assesses the progress of programs and projects and policies to learn lessons and to achieve these highly ambitious and sometimes overwhelmingly, broad goals. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Gentleman here at the front, thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Jean Massy. I'm in charge of the French Business Governance Association. I've worked for 30 years in the industry and in Africa. I would like to come back to what our colleague from Mali said. The issue that we have not answered relates to the processing of goods. Exporting raw materials to developed countries is one thing, but the added value is delocalized from the countries of origin. If you look at uranium, if you look at other minerals and metals, it's the processing that makes the difference. The education of people who are going to be working in processing is an area where we can generate jobs and reduce migratory flows. We can support SMEs through public will and the OECD that will drive the transformation towards a generation of added value in the countries of origin of the raw materials. That's a key there. Earlier you were talking about a wonderful example. Cement, for example. There is a billionaire who set up a cement works and an oil refinery, became a major investor over just 5 years. But what happened with the money? Well, it was repatriated to Luxembourg or somewhere else. The money of these investors tends to exit the country where the resources originated. But what can we do to counteract that? We've heard about encouraging American pension funds to invest in development, but that's not the way to go. I don't think that those kinds of examples are really where we should concentrate our efforts. The capital that is generated from adding value to these raw materials taken out of these countries should be pumped back into those countries. That's where it should stay in a way. That's the attitude that we should be looking at. We need to prepare the young generations. 70% of our populations are aged under 28, and they have expectations in Gabon, in Angola, in the Congo. I have two proposals. I wanted to say this already this morning, but given that we have people here from the OECD divisions, set up employee shareholding, prepare complementary pension schemes to provide support to employees, generate employee share ownership programs that enable people to put money aside and to support families. If possible, have this outside the control of the public authorities. Secondly, create a sovereign fund in the countries that generate the raw materials in Gabon, Angola, the Congo, in Nigeria. And you have banks, you have the Norges Bank, for example. They could be investing in the sub-Saharan African countries, not repatriating the money to the Western countries. I'm retired and I would be happy to volunteer my help to all of you. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'll come to the panel now. Very, very engaging and very rich thoughts coming out of the participants here today. Let me start with you, Martin. Just your general overview, your thoughts on what you've heard. Raquel spoke about philanthropy. Michel talked about his experience with PPPs. He said, look, there's no need to reinvent things. There are some things we've learned and we already have in place. I think we heard also that we have existing capacity that we're ignoring, and this is to the whole panel. I want you to speak to the issues that that you feel are most important. How can we use the capacity that actually exists better? Education systems, I couldn't agree more, and some of us need it more than others. That's the reality. Evaluation models, and of course the comments that have been shared by the gentleman who has offered his time. And for Africa, it remains a huge challenge. We need to process our own goods. We need to value add. We need to change the situation. Martin, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on the feedback from participants.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, a lot has been said, I think, in the panel discussions and from the floor about trust. I mean, there is a trust deficit, and I would want to just quickly address that. I mean, this is not the trust necessarily, or not exclusively, to the private sector and the public sector. There's a lot of mistrust within the public sector with other organizations, and I'm now a CEO of an organization that has to work with the public sector, implementing partners, governments, and providers of capital. I can see that there are significant areas of deficit of that trust within the development sector itself. That's something we have to actually address. Secondly, and by the way, so that the public sector doesn't have a monopoly on that particular question, but something they've got to address internally. To the capacity issue, one thing that drives me slightly insane on a daily basis is this ability for both the public and the private sector to reinvent value chains at the slightest opportunity. Because you're not prepared to get on with somebody else, you always think that you can actually do something better than they can, and therefore we have parallel systems which therefore do not take up the capacity that is already existing in the marketplace, irrespective of how poorly you think that is. The value for money is far greater improving on an existing system than it is building one in parallel. And it is not without its frustrations. It drives everybody completely nuts on a regular basis, but it really is worthwhile, because what happens is that then you get all the corporate sectors in the private sector wishing to go and do their own implementation. It happens in India already with the CSR legislation there, $2 to $3 billion per annum going into CSR projects, because there isn't a good platform that is there to be used as an implementing partner alongside local governments, identifying what the greatest needs are. Because there is a trust deficit on that angle, all the CSR money is delivered via those individual corporate entities with their own implementing system. it is complete madness. So one thing I just would say is it is worthwhile that sweat equity to try to work with systems that are not perfect rather than try to invent one which I guarantee will not be perfect either.
Thank you so much. Vitalice, I come to you now and the issues that were raised, and we know the challenges that we're facing on the African continent and perhaps other developing areas. Next steps, and for the longest time it's been, trade, not aid. And yet we still seem to be locked into this development donor-driven model that we really need to break out of. Considering the input and the thoughts shared, what are your comments on how we can add value? But also, I just want to share with you something coming in from Twitter. What can donors do to find new ways to help governments in developing countries work better with national private sector, from small enterprises to large corporations? So how do we build capacity within and across the different sectors?
Thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't have my earphones, so I could not gather much what he said. So I really
Let me break it down for you very, very quickly, if I can. So he talked about the fact that we must process our own goods. We need to start exporting raw materials. He talked about the fact that we need improved education, incentives as well. We need to build local companies within Africa. He talked about resource flows that are coming out of Africa. So, companies doing really well, and he mentioned a cement and an oil processing company, and the financial flows are sent outside of the continent. He talked about things that can be done, such as setting up employee shareholding programs, pension schemes, and various other things. And use of sovereign funds, raising sovereign funds for use to develop the national, to develop our countries in many ways. So, sorry, I just tried to summarize it. So there you go. Your thoughts on those contributions?
No, I think he's actually quite on point. The issue of the need for Africa to add value to its own raw materials and turn them into much more, not to sell them raw, but add some value to them in a manner that they can better fetch good prices for that. That has been always in the cards. And in fact, in that context, the issue of how we build our industries, how we strengthen them, and indeed that's why the African continent has been talking about strengthening the industrial growth, building infrastructure to support that, and I think that is part of the agenda for Africa in the 2063.
In terms of action points, what can the development world, your sphere, do to enhance that particular space? And it's both building companies at national level, but also ensuring that we are able to value add.
Mm-hmm. So, let me go properly now. In terms, first there is the capacity building issue before I come to that. Capacity building issue here is not just a broader capacity. We are talking about private sector venturing into development. Do they know anything about development? They know something about investment and making profit. But getting livelihood and improving that's another business altogether. And for that, if they are going to put resources into that, they need to understand that, and they need to be equipped properly to be able to handle development agenda. And that also goes to the investment companies, or let's say the EU banks, development banks that deal with them. How do they make sure that financial instruments that they have is able to build, has a component of capacity building that ensures that if we are blending, using ODA money to support private sector, that indeed the development component of it has the capacity to transform lives, and they're able to be held accountable on that. That's what I'm saying. Now, I think one of the things that we need to understand in the context of Africa is that, one, there is a real desire to change. And what we need to do is, first of all, to reform policies that look inwardly in a manner that recognizes the SMEs. And I think we need to think about how we create the enabling environment for small and medium-scale enterprises. And this is where also the international community can help development partners by creating products that directly support small-scale and media-scale enterprises to be able to also produce products that are consumable, not just within the market, but also outside. And I think that's where energies need to go to.
Thank you for that. And Malin, I come to you so much in terms of different perspectives. You started us off actually by talking about the importance of each different sector, knowing what they bring to the table and being able to partner. What are your thoughts considering other contributions that have been made this afternoon?
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting comments. And just one comment on you're totally right. The private sector, we don't really know about development work. And that's why we have to work in partnerships. So that's why we, for example, team up with SIDA, USAID or UNIDO and the local companies or institutions in order to build capacity. So I think that's for sure the right thing. Just a few other things. I think if we are going to be successful, we can't be short-termed here as well. We have talked about projects and so on, but also in the way we view the effects, measuring the effects of different projects in a correct way. And let me take one concrete example. If we are a supplier of buses, and we learn from the SDG agenda that infrastructure and public transport is crucial for development, and we have different choices here. We can either improve the refineries to lower the sulfur halt, in order to have more environmental enhanced buses. We can go for biogas, but then the plants needs to be there and the resources to fill those. Or we can go directly to electric buses. I know that there is a shortage of power, of course, but let's look at the total cost and the societal benefits of those projects instead of looking at the purchasing cost. And another point that I wanted to make is actually we are happy to, as a company, as a global company, we would love to expand our business, of course, and create real jobs in many markets. But when there is an unstable environment, where there is a lack of respect for human rights, where there are political instability, armed conflicts, and high level of corruption, we are very reluctant to do direct investments. And we normally talk about the SDG agenda as a lot of opportunities, but let us not forget also to work on this more of the basic issues that has to be there in order for the private sector to do investments. I totally agree that we should keep the jobs in the African continent or in each country actually, but we as a private sector will not do a plant if there is too high risks. We want to work in an environment that is stable and predictable. So that's things that we want to emphasize in this dialogue as well.
So that's an important fact, and perhaps there's a gap that some of the other partners can play in is how to minimize risk, to get private sector involved in situations where we continue to need their input. Thomas, your thoughts on what's been shared?
Right, I also agree with the point that the private sector may not know much about development. But I don't think that's necessary because the core of a partnership is really combining capacities, right? What the private sector knows is how to make money and how to make profitable business and run profitable business. And there's nothing wrong with that as well. If you combine those, I think that would be the core of the development partnership, to combine those capacities, as opposed to building up capacities in the individual silos. So it's one thing that I wanted to mention on this. The other thing is, it sounds also negative, right? Also difficult, and they don't have the capacities. But if you want to involve the private sector, you need to create something that's called opportunities. And if you create opportunities, then you create optimism, because people want to pursue those opportunities. They want to be successful. That's why they run and work in private business. And to create optimism for development really means creating opportunities, and opportunities are business opportunities. If you see in finance, like you see in finance, microinsurance, micro loans, micro financing, this is nothing else than making money from a finance sector perspective. The other thing I want to touch on is what you say, Tyler. Allianz, a couple of years ago, we were heavily attacked by a couple of NGOs because we are a heavy insurer, a big global insurer. We are insuring infrastructure projects across the world. Very difficult from an environmental and social and even governance perspective. But on the other hand, we are also a very huge investor. We are investing much money into all kinds of assets in order to return investment or provide a return to our insurance clients. So we thought about this. We didn't like, of course, to be attacked. And then we combined this into one thing that we call ESG, Environmental Social Governance approach, and we institutionalized this within our company. And that relates to what you said about trust. So we brought these NGOs who attacked us on the table, sitting around the table and talking about why we insure a dam in Brazil or wherever, and what we now do as a proactive and active insurer to talk to our customers about the ESG aspects of their projects, I think makes much more sense than simply withdrawing and saying, oh, we don't do this anymore. Same as on the investing side. We disinvest from coal. This is not just because we want to be good people and coal is seen as bad, and coal mining is seen as bad business, but we also pursue a business interest there because we do believe that in 30, 40 years, coal is out. So we are taking a long-term strategic investment decision, but combining it with something that is seen by many, many people as a very good purpose. And I think that's the trick, right? If you combine those capacities, that does the trick also in development.
Thank you so much. Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that there's a happy level of agreement across the panel from our different perspectives. When I was in government and had responsibilities for these matters, I always thought that the two key areas which the private sector and the development sector could both unite on were issues of evaluation and openness and transparency. And as far as government was concerned, we set up, and it wasn't something which was easy for government to do, we set up an independent evaluation mechanism, the ICAI, the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which reviewed the way in which we were spending public money and reported not to ministers who can sweep inconvenient truths under the carpet, but to the legislature, to Parliament. And that increased the amount of accountability. And I think that someone was talking earlier on about the importance of evaluation on education. I mean, the finest levels of evaluation of added value in education, not just getting bottoms on seats in classrooms, but what is actually added there in terms of the local market's needs and so on, is a charity based in Cambridge in England called CAMFED. And CAMFED specialises in getting girls into school in some of the most difficult parts of the world and on evaluating and explaining to people who are carrying out this work and donors exactly how successfully it can be done. And business, for all the reasons that have been rehearsed, their contribution comes with divided loyalties to development aims, loyalties to their shareholders, their workforce and so forth. But again, openness and transparency helps cement good relationships across the business and the development sectors. And I think, the OECD, one of the questions you were asking earlier was what can the OECD do in this space? And it seems to me the OECD can help to hold the ring on what are the right business practices. In DFID in Britain, we were always very careful to say when we were engaging with the private sector that we had a very strong, decent labour practices agenda, and we expected wherever the public money was being spent in conjunction with the private sector, that we would see these decent labour practices honoured. So, I think there's a happy conjunction of views on your panel, but for both the private sector and for the non-for-profit charitable sector, evaluation and transparency goes an awful long way to dissolving potential conflict and misunderstandings and making sure we're all on the same space.
Right, so the importance of getting as many people as possible seated at the table, listening to each other's voices. The dialogue is absolutely critical. Let me come to your thoughts now, Ulises.
Sorry, thank you. No, I agree with those that that have said that with Malin for one, that we do not need to be short-sighted or short-termed. But I would say that it implies not only to the future, but also to the past. And I'm coming back to what the gentleman was saying. Of course, when we have a sense of where we're coming from and where we're heading, then that would be, as the Secretary General of OECD has been saying repeatedly, we have the correct GPS of what we're aiming at. So I think that's very important. It's very simple, but believe me, I've been 25 years following UN debates. Normally, it's very easy to lose track of where do we come from and where we want to go. And from that perspective, of course, probably when we say innovative, probably we do not need to be that elaborated or that complex. Let me give you just an example. We've been promoting, Mexico has been promoting this approach towards South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. Well, nowadays we have an excellent collaboration and very, very fruitful project that involves the Mexican and the German development cooperation agencies, assisting Guatemala and Honduras micro, medium enterprises in order to foster the incorporation of these businesses into the change of production and distribution. And by doing so, we've been also fostering sustainable development criteria. This is very simple, yet this has been very, very useful. Just in these 6 months that we've been engaging in this exercise, you can not only talk about the policy benefits of this exercise, but also the profit that these small businesses have been doing. And yet, this is a very simple, and still what I've heard when I share this information with other colleagues, it seems to me that this has been among the first time that this kind of scheme has been used, and we are trying to replicate it. So being innovative does not mean that we need to be quite complex in order to pursue our common goals.
And that's good to know that simple solutions can be applied and they can work, because sometimes it feels like we need rocket science, but it may not be necessary. And these are the kind of models that we really do need. As we come towards the end, our final session really is going to be focused on a call to action this afternoon. And I do want to take some more comments really directed to what you think partners should be doing or shared experiences on lessons that have worked in your environments. Does anyone want to share with us before I bring it to the panel to give their parting? Please, thank you so much. The lady in blue. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes? Oh, great. Gentleman there. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Ellen Connor from Helio International. Malin Ripa has stressed the need for investors to feel secure and have limited risk in their investments. Might be the same for donors also who want to be efficient. I want to draw your attention to financial indices which measure the capacity of countries to really be good recipient of investment going towards eco-development. This is a French think tank who has done that, and it's now on the web, but I could provide you the initial documents.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Really good contribution. There's a gentleman. Okay, so there are two hands on this side, and then there's a couple of gentlemen on that side. Maybe you could start there. Right. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Ibrahim Akan. I'm the CEO of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Senegal. And we have created this fund, which is not, let's say, actually acting as a wealth fund, but mainly as a strategic fund that's put public money to seed projects and develop them up to, let's say, bankability and open the capital to investors. That's the way we proceed. And we've done, let's say, a couple of projects in energy, in health, working with other investors. We have some successes in solar power plant, a 30-megawatt power plant that we are going to start operating this month, health center, etc., etc., etc. So this is one type of experience I would like to share, saying that public money can seed project and open the capital to private sector money.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, gentleman at the back, his hand is, yes, up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nonak Shmani. I'm heading the Allianz for Integrity, a German development cooperation project. I have one question which in my view is key, and especially to the private sector colleagues, but also maybe to the colleague who came from the UK. What is important for you guys when you want to invest in a country? You have Malin had started to say a few points, and it was at that time when I was thinking about that question. Maybe Thomas, you can add, and also Martin. What are maybe in 3 points, what are the most important? And one warning from a lot of work that we are doing, and just last week I was also here at the OECD Integrity Week, also moderating a panel where we talked about trust. We should not forget there are not only the people who are here, there is the general public, and I think we have to communicate better also with the general public about these topics, because I can quite well understand if 60% of the people are against the cooperation between private sector and public sector. So this communication with them is also important, and expectation management. We're talking about opportunities and so on, but there are also partly limited. Maybe this is just an advice. And lastly, great moderation. I've seen quite a lot of events also here, and I think it's very well organized.
Wow, thank you so much. As the mic heads in that direction, put your hand up if you need to speak. You know, I host a show called Africa Leadership Dialogues, and 2 months ago I realized I was speaking to leaders in silos. I'll give you the floor in a moment, in one moment. So the optimistic thing is that when you bring people to the room, they are willing and open. So the first thing has got to be to get more people in the room across the sectors, and especially from the micro to medium sized. And once we do, it makes things so much more easier. Please, sir, you may go ahead now. Thank you.
Oui, mais moi, je voudrais faire simplement une...
So, I just have a comment to make on the public-private dialogue. Don't you think that privatization of whole public sector areas hampers the dialogue between the public sector and the private sector?
Please repeat the question, sir. Thank you.
Privatization of whole sectors, vital sectors of the public sector. You know that we are in a period of liberalism, and everything is being privatized, while they are very important sectors for human beings. And it is necessary to protect those sectors. And my question is as follows. Now, so when the public sector is yielding its responsibilities to the public sector, it is difficult to have a dialogue between the public sector and the private sector.
That, sir, I think some of our panelists will certainly address that question. Another hand was up. Yes, go ahead, please.
Good evening. Mirko Tricoli from the Italian Development Agency. I think that probably something missing in this very interesting panel is something related to the needs of the developing countries. The ideas and the transfer knowledge of private sector is fundamental, but the needs, it should be, in my opinion, the starting point. Second thing, very related to this, is the concept of inclusive business. This is something that could really match the SDGs and the willingness of the private sector to do some things effective for achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So again, very interesting points. Perhaps I will start on this side with you, Ulises, this time. private sector, and I particularly want to address that issue of the yielding of public sector responsibility to the private sector and concern around that. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. When we're talking about dialogue between public and private, at least from my perspective, we're not implying that we would be privatizing even the dialogue itself. Of course, there's a continued trend towards discussing the amount of public and private, let's say, jurisdiction. But historically, I would tend to argue that it has come like a pendulum. Sometimes we're feeling that it is closer to the private sector than the public sector. But again, in the macro picture, I think we're still striving to get the right mix. I don't have the feeling that we are aiming recklessly towards privatization. Thank you very much. Quite a difficult word.
Thank you for that. Other interesting thoughts shared, a seed money invested in various different projects. The Senegal example was given. But Andrew, let me come to you still on this issue of privatization of public assets. And it seems to be the popular thing. It seems to be the done thing in the world today, but there's still some concern.
I think a lot of this has moved on, actually, from the time when many people in this room will remember in the 70s and 80s when the IMF had a one-size-fits-all approach to economic reform, and when the World Bank was insisting on privatization. If you wanted money out of the World Bank at that stage, the World Bank would take quite an ideological approach and would be likely to say that if you want these funds, this is how you must spend it, and often it had to do with privatization. Now, my view is that you look at the results, and for the donor community, for everybody really in this game, the importance of demonstrating that you're spending money well and you're getting results is absolutely critical. And so when we looked at supporting water projects, for example, in Pakistan, I declined to get into the debate about privatization or non-privatization. What I wanted to do was two things. I wanted something that definitely worked, and something that was with the grain of the policy priorities of the partner country. And in the end, unless you have a partnership where you have agreement on how you're going to, in this example, deliver water to communities which don't have access to it, unless you have agreement with the partner on how that's going to be done, it isn't going to work. So I think a lot of the old-fashioned ideological arguments about privatization or not have given way to arguments about what is the most effective way of delivering the result we all want to see. Now, I think you wanted to ask of one public-private approach which we all think is the best, is a good one to put on the table today. And I have an offer for that question, Julie, which is this. I think that in order to will a result and get a result, we should make greater use, when we're working between the public-private sector, of challenge funding. And my answer to your question would be, let's use challenge funds to bring together public and private funding on a specific agricultural set of objectives. And, everyone in this room will have loads of agricultural objectives and priorities that they want to see stimulated and effected. And I think the challenge fund mechanism is a very good way, in many cases, of getting that conjunction between public and private and the results that you want to see achieved.
Thank you for that. And sticking with results and the question of addressing the needs of society, Thomas and Malin, I come to both of you with this. We should be starting with the needs and then moving from there. So how would that model work for the private sector, and how do the different partners then input and identify companies that are willing to work in the various respective areas?
That's a very interesting question, and that brings me back to what I said earlier. If you want to involve the private sector, the business case comes first, right? And the business case is based on certain needs that have been identified by the business or by the private entity that want to make a profit. So I would be surprised. I mean, of course, business cases may fail, and then there were different assumptions or wrong assumptions, but I would be surprised if they would not start with identifying the needs first and then addressing them and finding a solution for how to address those needs in business. And I think that's a basic thing of doing business, really identifying the business case and the needs you want to serve. I want to go back to the question that Noor Naqshbandi raised, and this is what the expectation of private investors or private sector is in terms of the regulatory framework. Of course, very basic things, very principled things, and that have been said many times before. But what you need is a stable regulatory environment. And you need a level playing field for both foreign investors and the local business. And it's not just about the law that is written on paper, it's also about enforcement. That's often forgotten because in many, many countries you have strict laws, rules and regulations apply, but they're not necessarily enforced in a way you would expect this to be enforced, and so the law fails. And if we change this, by the way, also by dialogue between public sector and, in this case, some often foreign investors, then it may change. Then you may create the environment for sustainable business in a certain location. What we don't want to see is an unpredictable law where you can't be sure that you are not seeing surprises in the course or during the duration of for example, a project that you finance.
Right, so certainty is key. Malin?
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to comment on the private sector involvement. When we, to take one concrete example, when we decided to do this strategic work on our growth in Africa, one of the basic principles that we agreed about within the Volvo group was that let the governments take their responsibility and not interfere with the public sector responsibility in a country. So that means for us then we should be a complement to the educational system. So just to point out that our training is a post-gymnasium training, vocational training, and I think that's very important because the private sector we might fail on one market and then we don't want the people to be suffering from that. So I think that's quite important. And how we then do it in reality, we look at what is the business opportunities, what are the challenges in the society, and we try to find a match between those two and try to address that issue. And in this case, we saw that the business case was we need skilled mechanics, and we saw that the challenge in the societies were there is a lack of decent jobs and skilled mechanics. So we found this match, and that's what we called shared value, and that is what we wanted to apply. I also wanted to comment a few things on what Andrew said. I think it's brilliant to bring together the funding and the different partners who want to agree and work together on a certain goal or topic. And I have a wish, and that is that we need to have a place where we can easily find those opportunities. It might be a web page, just to have the first initial contacts, and then of course we should continue the dialogue one-to-one. But as it is today, it's for us as a large company, we can attend these types of conferences. But the small, medium sizes they can't. They don't have the resources, and they don't have people in all countries if they want to engage in infrastructure projects, for example, because the information about the ongoing infrastructure projects is on a country level. So we have to make it much easier.
So we were discussing it in the morning, and what we said, basically, it's like an online matchmaking forum, similar to a dating forum, but for private sector development players and government to pitch in and out as required, right? Okay, so that's interesting. A Tinder for development for SDGs. Thank you, Malin, for that. Let me come to you, Meja, now. And this whole idea of starting from needs really makes sense. So what lessons can we take from that we could adopt in our own environments to ensure that we are beginning the conversation with the needs of society and the development needs?
Yeah, I think, yes, we must start from the needs. And what is key in that regard is understanding those needs first and not assuming them. And in that regard, I think country leadership is very important, and I agree with you. And so how we develop relevant structures that is able to mobilize for those needs, how we develop the institutions that is also able to mobilize for that is very important. But I think also the needs are not necessarily sufficient if the funding is wrong. If the funding is directed towards initiatives that are not empowering and are disempowering the citizens, then it really doesn't make sense whether you understand the needs. So we must also reform the funding instruments. And that's why I think I agree with the gentleman who was talking about the private sector issue. Because increasingly we are talking, when it comes to implementation of the SDGs, we are marveling at the trillions that the private sector people have. But we are really not talking about the need for behavior change that is needed for us to implement the SDGs. We are really not talking about the kind of the relevant financial instruments that are important in implementing SDGs. And that, for me, is really a worrisome thing. Because, for example, when you go to the ODA issue, we are increasingly talking about blending finance. Now, when you're talking about blending finance and really don't define how companies are going to use that money to address the development issue, then that's a challenge. When the government, for example, of Kenya decides that we are going to provide land for power generation to a PPP project, or buy the product, the service from a PPP project, without necessarily looking at whether they are hospitals or schools, and diverting those resources to subsidize for that kind of a PPP project, then that's the problem. And that's, I think, those are the things that we really need to talk about going forward and see, is it really necessary that we prioritize a given sector in how we can tap into their trillions without looking at how are we going to change our behavior to change this planet going forward, because we are all responsible for it in the end.
Right. We're in it together. Martin, I come to you, and one question was posed. What's important when you are investing? What are people looking for? What are you looking for?
Well, I'm looking for accountability, traceability, and transparency. And I'm not only the person looking for it. If the private sector are going to give me money, those are the questions that they're asking me, and I've got to hold the implementing partners that we use to account to provide that. So it's not me just being gratuitous, those are the questions. On a bigger scale than this, in terms of, I think the gentleman over there in the corner was asking, what do we need to invest? Land rights are incredibly important, the rule of law, and of course the government providing some sort of environment whereby the private sector can create jobs. Those are the three things that I would say on that particular aspect. So in terms of the private sector that we've been talking about, we've got to realize from the public sector or the development sector perspective, we are not quite as sexy as you think that we are if we've only got less than 10% of the private sector in this room today, of the people here. We can't talk about the private sector in a vacuum thinking that they're hearing us. And if the private sector were here today listening to what we are saying about them, they will probably think we're probably a bit delusional. So I think that we've got to encourage the private sector to be part of the discussion, not a recipient of what we decided it should look like. If we don't have that traceability, accountability, and transparency, in other words, holding ourselves together, we've just got to up our game, I think, to make ourselves more attractive, to stop other people reinventing value chains. I think it's really, really important, because there is a feeling within the private sector, and perception is reality, that if we don't have that traceability and the opaque and the transparency and accountability that they're looking for, we're funding ideology. It is not compelling to go to the private sector and tell them that we can spend their money better than they can spend their money. I promise you that's not a compelling argument.
Thank you so much. What an incredible panel, and we're coming to the end. I mentioned the stakeholder forum that we held with my show about 2 months ago, a month and a half ago. And the good news, it was like 80% private sector. You open the doors to private sector. If they see an opportunity, they will come in. And I think from there, it's the work of the development world and all the other partners to really sit at the table together and model the way forward. I have a wonderful saying that I will share with you now, another African proverb, and this one goes, no matter how many times you milk a cow, it cannot produce butter. And I think we need to wake up. We all need to wake up. Business as usual does not work. The model has to change. I want a parting shot from our wonderful panelists today. In 30 seconds, what is that critical change we need to see? As we head to the end of this day's very rich discussions, we're going to have a call to action. What's your parting shot? Malin, you started us off. I'll come to you first. Please, thank you.
Thank you. I have to say that I believe that trust is probably among the different actors and understand our roles. That's the basic part that we have to fix before we can go and have efficient partnerships, because lack of trust, that means high transaction cost. So we need to do that, fix that first.
Thank you so much. Meja, let me come to you next.
Well, I just want to take it off from you that SDGs requires business unusual behavior. And for that, we must really change the way we do business, the way we fund business, and the way in which we implement development initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Martin, on the end, please go ahead.
I think probably just repeating what I've already repeated before, marriage is really, really hard. And you know that that actual initial vow that you take is actually the first step in a long relationship that needs working at. Please don't implement. Please make sure that you improve existing value chains. Really work hard at doing that. In the end, it's worth the effort, and actually the money will be more impactful.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thomas?
I don't have an own thought, but I want to copy one of yours, because you said there are many people are willing, or most people are willing, both from the private sector and from the public sector, and also from civil society. But the trick is to bring them together and have them, as the gentleman said, sitting around the table and then start talking. And this dialogue will produce much more than sitting in a 10% private and 80% public sector representative roundtable.
Thank you so much. Andrew?
Well, I think it would be what I said at the beginning, which is don't just mouth the mantra, internalize the fact that the private sector is not the enemy of development, it is the engine of it.
Thank you. Ulises?
I will put it into words: recognition and coherence. Recognition, realizing which role every one of us is playing, namely the private sector and the government. And secondly, coherence, because not only do we need to speak the same language, we need to coordinate and try to make a coherent work in order to achieve our common goals.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to the panel. And thank you so much to all those who shared thoughts and interventions. And I will ask, please do not leave. Our final session is starting within the next few minutes, and we're going to have a call to action. So please remain seated. Don't leave the room. Let's do this together. Let's finish this together. Thank you so much.
Well done. Chapeau. No, and your guidance was...
Oh, thank you. Well done, Julie. You were great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're not in it together. Thank you. Great.
Getting a picture, look.
So we are looking forward to your program.
Yes, good, yes, and I'll send you the links.
Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect. Very well.
How insensitive I must have seemed when he told me that he loved me. how unmoved and cold I must have seemed when he told me so sincerely why he must have asked. Did I just turn and stare in icy silence? What was I to say? What can one say? When a love affair is ended. Now he's gone away. And I'm alone. With the memory of that last look. Drawn and sad. I must have seemed all that heartbreak in that last look. Why he must have asked. Did I just turn and stare with icy silence? What was I to say? What can one say? When a love affair is ended, is ended. No.
Ursula.
He's gone away. And I'm alone. With a memory of his last look. Vague and drawn and sad. I see it now. All that heartbreak in that last look. Why, he must have asked. Did I just turn and stare? In icy silence. What was I to say? What can one say? When a love affair
Okay. Hello. Hello? Ah, it's on. Okay, if you can take your seats, we'll get you out of here pretty soon. It's been a long and very productive day. We have two more panelists. They'll be here or they won't, but I don't want to keep all of you waiting for our wisdom. Okay, all right, here we go. My name is Doug Frantz. Here comes Pierre. We'll give him 30 seconds to run to the stage. Okay, my name is Doug Frantz. I'm the Deputy Secretary General, and as the Secretary General said this morning, it took a year to put together our action plan. Wasn't all my fault. This is the closing session. We just called it the closing session, but I would prefer to think of it as a call to action. And we'll try and boil down some of the thoughts that came up in the opening session and then in the separate panel sessions during what was, I think, an enormously productive and occasionally provocative day. We learned a lot, and I think we learned a lot about the necessity of figuring out what we don't know in terms of building partnerships, in terms of translating rhetoric into action. I think so, what's most important now is that we need to work together to deliver on this talk. A lot has been said about the need for new partnerships to achieve the SDGs. The problem is, I think, that we tend to be big on vision and sometimes short on detail. And that's really one of the reasons that we wanted such a diverse crowd, and we're really thrilled to have gotten such a diverse crowd here for this conference today. We have people from all of the sectors necessary to build these partnerships. And so that's a big victory just to start. But, beyond that, we need to develop the sustained, here comes Jeremy. Thank you. All the way from Versailles. We need sustained political will from governments and from the private sector to make this partnership work. I think of this in terms of being a NATO problem and not North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but rather no action, talk only. Governments have to commit to the SDGs, and the private sector has to commit to the SDGs. We all have to take a responsibility for them. And I think you heard that in the opening session very eloquently from the Secretary General and from all three of the other speakers. I thought they made a really interesting, complementary presentation on the moral imperative and the business strategy of the SDGs. We had an SDG council meeting yesterday, and Annika Lindblom from Finland, who's in charge of the SDGs in the Prime Minister's office, made a brilliant presentation. And the one line that stuck out in her comments to me were that we talk here at the OECD about a whole-of-government approach, but Annika said what's needed is a whole-of-society approach. And I think from the sessions that I sat in on today, and from the reports that we just got from our rapporteurs who were there, there is a clear understanding that this is about building partnerships and about building trust. I thought it was really interesting to see some of the tweets pop up on the screens as the sessions were going on. And with due respect to whoever's tweet it wasn't Donald Trump, it was someone else. The tweet that I saw said that I wrote it down here. Excuse me. I want to get it right because I thought it was so wrong. Here it is. Dialogue doesn't build trust. Delivering on commitments does. I think that certainly we need to fulfill our commitments, but it starts with dialogue. And I think that's what what we've heard here all day long. It starts with dialogue. You're not going to get there if you don't begin with dialogue, if you don't go out and use not your one mouth, but your two ears to listen. And I think that's really a vital first step. So while I understand the need to deliver on commitments, the second half of that tweet, I really would object to the idea that anything that dismisses dialogue, because that's what we need. And I hope that that's what we're going to get to here with my fellow panelists, whom I'll turn this over to momentarily. I thought that we did also see some elements of bringing this SDGs down to concrete reality. I think that's critical. They're so huge, they're so abstract, that bringing them down to reality was valuable. Ahmed Aziz Diallo, who's the mayor of a town in Burkina Faso, in one of the sessions put it very well. He said that the NGOs and the government assistance agencies never get down to my level. It always stops at the national level. And you know, particularly in a place like Burkina Faso, where there are so many problems at the local level, you know, that's something we need to be thinking about, something we need to think about how we can remedy that. And then in another panel, Thomas Lösler of Allianz gave, I thought, a very good example for the business rationale of having sustainability at the heart of your model. And that was, he talked about why Allianz no longer invests in coal mines. He said, you know, for one thing, you get a lot of grief from the public for investing in coal mines, but he said, more importantly, from a business perspective, they're not sustainable. They're going to be gone in a couple of decades. You know, so that's just a concrete example of how we can absorb this. I thought that the comments from BNP Paribas, from Elaine, were just terrific today about the business consequences and the business motivations. So I'm going to turn this over to the panelists, and I hope we can have a conversation, because as part of this call to action and part of the NATO theory here, I would like to hear from the three of you about what you see as the most concrete steps that we need to take here, because I think this conversation is different from what it would have been in 2015 before the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And so I think that's progress, but I think there is so much more to do. And the last thing that I would offer is that I used to be a newspaper reporter and editor, and for a very long time. And what I see with the SDGs and what I worry about is that we're failing to tell the story of the SDGs. We're failing to talk to the whole of society. And that's a failure at the UN. It's a failure at the OECD. It's a failure of NGOs. It's a failure of the private sector. And so that's one of the things that I hope we can do better also. And it's something that I'm working with our communications people here to do. Because if we don't tell that story, we're going to lose the political backing that is essential to moving forward with this agenda. And there is no more essential agenda in the world today than this blueprint for going from the world we have to the world we want. The panelists, Jeremy Oppenheim has a long and storied career as a consultant with McKinsey, but he has devoted himself to the bright side, to the light, and worked for the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. Amy Jadasimi talked about their report this morning. She gave you the highlights out of it. I hope that Jeremy can tell us a little bit more about how to motivate the business sector to participate in the SDGs, because it's really something that he knows very well, and I know that from our long conversations. Next to Jeremy is Charlotte Petri Gornitzka, who is the chair of the Development Assistance Committee here. She's in charge of official development assistance. So she has a big burden, but she's taken it on very creatively, and we're hoping for that. I'm sure that she's gotten an enormous amount of brilliant ideas out of this for how to modernize ODA and the role that ODA will play as a catalyst, particularly in the least developed countries. And then at the end down there is Ambassador Pierre Duquesne, who is the ambassador of France to the OECD. He's also the chairman of the governing board of the Development Center, which played an enormous role in organizing this forum and in bringing all of you here. The Development Center is a vital part of the OECD because its membership is far broader, much more diverse. I think there are 52 members, 29 of whom are OECD members, 23 of whom are non-members of the OECD. And so the diversity of voices there, their views on policies, is a great learning experience for us. So I think I'll start down at the end with Pierre. And Pierre, if you could talk to us a little bit about what you saw today. Thank you. Put on your headphones.
Yes, please. Not only we are in Paris, but yes, French is one of the two official languages of this organization. Je sais pas si je vais être...
Now, I don't quite know whether I'll be able to be quite as tangible as the chair wanted me to be, but I should like to take to the third dimension, or to the twilight zone, three twilight zones linked to the objectives, Sustainable Development Goals, in line with what the Development Center does. First of my three dimensions is the third implementation, as it were. What the SDGs want us to do is to implement the goals at home in northern countries. Sorry, but this is my one of my caps, and Charlotte will be talking about that later, I'm sure. And also in the countries that receive aid, in other words, countries of the south. But there is a third dimension, is to look at the impact of the policies of the ones with the others, and vice versa, in both looking at both directions. And what I thought was quite interesting, listening to Mr. Cloyter and Mrs. Williams, is that in that vision, ODA is not seen as a source of funding, but rather as a catalyst in order to establish relationships between states, companies, etc., governments and corporations. And Mr. Guriev talked about that earlier. There's the issue of governance also, which becomes common for backing countries, or for both backing countries and countries receiving aid. So it applies across the board to both ends of the story. Now, the private sector also wants to be involved in the governance projects. So, by the way, Doug, it's 27 OECD countries, 25 non-OECD countries, I'm sorry to correct you, but it's the only place in the world governance system where all of these countries actually talk to one another on an equal footing. This is quite unique. Why? Because we don't give any financing, we don't set standards, we don't make political speeches, as is the case here or there. But this is an indispensable tool in our global system, even more so for the SDGs. This is the only place, by the way, where we can actually exchange on these issues. The third dimension, I'm hoping that you can follow, is the third universality. In other words, you have the universality of goals, Sustainable Development Goals, then you have the universality of countries, and at the same time, you have the universality of actors, stakeholders. And this is the reason why we're here today. Mr. Mitchell said it, the private sector can be seen as one of the driving engines for development. That raises questions. I mean, can we actually make money on the SDGs? This is a good question asked by Mr. Meja. But this is a genuine question. Same thing for local actors and stakeholders, and the mayor recalled that very clearly. So you have so many different stakeholders, and in my country, in France, I was in charge of the French position, coordinating the French position following the earthquake in Haiti. That was back in 2010. But for the first time, following this major disaster, that private stakeholders, local authorities, NGOs would actually gather to talk about those development issues. Now, talking about the center doesn't have any relationship with all stakeholders, but there are niches for the for MNET companies. Then you have foundations and private funding, Net for Work, and then there's a tool, a very specific tool, which are called the MDCR, multi-dimensional country reviews, which mean that you can implement or monitor the implementation of these SDGs. And amongst the stakeholders or the actors, you have the SMEs, which play a unique role because the SMEs are the silent majority, in a way, of non-governmental stakeholders. NGOs you can hear, cities you can hear, companies you can hear, but then there is this silent majority, that would be the SMEs. And the third dimension, as it were, is the commitment of countries of the North, developed countries, in other words. They need to meet the SDGs in the North. They should help or assist southern countries in achieving these SDGs in the South. And there are huge financial needs, but these are reasonable when you think about it. And from the outset, we know that private investments, private funding, innovative, the blended, can help. And then there's not just financial support, there's more. There's technical aid coming from companies, building capacities, etc. This is quite new. I mean, if somebody had said that like 2-3 years ago, everybody would have laughed. But in the development family, we've talked a lot about that. Then the development center can also help do and promote something else, not just pure aid. It can be based on its regional statistical analyses, the dialogues set up on managing human resource, natural resources, private sector from the south, from the north, governments on global value chains. And, of course, the Development Center has the basic indicator on monitoring gender equality based on institutions, which is also a global public good. Last but not least, I would say that there is another third dimension in the philosophy of development. Now, the SDGs indeed are goals with targets, but at the same time, these are momentums, dynamics, and these are also negotiating venues or places. And today's meeting bears witness to that. And indeed, this is certainly in line with what economists rediscovered recently. These are the commons. What's a common? A common is a management mode that dates back to the Middle Ages, managing local, cultural, economic resources, and associating to the management of those resources a collective of people who are concerned by that management. And you have multi-century commons in forestry, fisheries, etc. But there might be new commons in health, education, societal challenges, and that would need to be managed commonly, all the way to a collaborative economy, inclusive economy, a circular economy, a Silicon Valley of the North or the South, etc. So I suggest you see the Development Center as the common, the negotiating place of that common being the SDGs themselves. And that, in turn, means that we should use that body to move from the local experience to more globalized management modes to see what the role of government can be and what the role of the private sector can be, because that was our focus today in the management of commons. And these SDGs are the 21st century commons. Thank you.
Development Center. Charlotte, I would like to... There was a lot of conversation in all of the sessions about official development assistance, and it wasn't in the vein of being complaints, but in the sense of concerns that it's more important now than ever. And so I wonder if you could sort of update us on where you see the modernization of official development assistance going, and what you took away from some of the comments today, and how that may affect your views of ODA.
Thank you very much. And may I start by saying I don't think it's a burden to represent 30 nations who together represents still 80% about of the total official support for aid. I don't think that that's how we're going to achieve the SDGs, but it's an opportunity that we bring to the table. And when we listen to Amina and others this morning, I think, and the Secretary General, I think we need to hold ourselves to account to really, really, really deliver the ODA commitments that we've made. If we talk about ODA is important, but other financial flows is the solution, I think we run the risk of shying away a bit. I think we need to stand still for a while and say, yes, but we cannot do the other things if we don't deliver on the ODA commitments, because there is credibility and trust and real money in that. Part of what the call to action that we need to do ourselves is to hold this community to account to deliver on its commitments and to safeguard ODA so that it is not a tool for a lot of things that is not the intention of the ODA. So we have to debate that up front. Political realities is surrounding us, and we need to take that debate because we need, and this is also where we need this ODA money. We need a bit of that ODA to catalyze other financial flows, to modernize the way we use ODA. And we're delivering on that. The DAC committee will take a decision on how to incentivize private sector investments in development when they are developmental in nature, not market distortion, not trying to fragment the world. It's really about incentivize other actors' investments for development. So it's a kind of a fight on two fronts. Safeguard what is there and take part of that to incentivize other financial flows. And what I take away from the discussion today is that when we are in this public sphere as well as the private sphere, I think today that I was surprised personally that so many of you in this room still are doubtful that private-public solutions are the solution to development. More than 50% said that when we had a poll. I thought, perhaps not that we agreed that, perhaps not that we are convinced that it's a solution, but I thought perhaps that we were more optimistic about the opportunity than that. That's my interpretation. And at the same time, so that I would say, have we come further 2017 than 2015 on discussing public-private? Not sure, on one hand. On the other hand, I heard, let's spend 10% of pension funds investment for SDGs. I didn't hear that 2 years ago. So it is this kind of reality I think we are in, where on one hand, we still need, and people like I who've been advocating for the interface between public and private for many years, we need to realize that there's no narrative which is compelling enough, perhaps because there are still too few realities with proofs of the concept still. So we still need to build the trust and realize that new people, I'm impatient, I want to act. But at the same time, we need to realize that we haven't convinced the world to act or what to act upon. And that's not a wake-up call, but a reminder that we still need the dialogue dog that you are talking about. For me, I think dialogue has been, well, isn't there a fatigue? Do we really need to talk to each other between this? Don't we need to work together and talk about what we do together? We probably need both, because many people have referred to the trust issue, and the trust issue goes, I think, deeper. And we need to realize that there are people who think that when public money, somebody said there's no such thing, but there is some money there. When they are being spent in projects where private sector can be enabled to do things, it's really not what the public money should be used for, and we create distrust. And why should you incentivize private sector with public money, things that they know that they can do themselves and all of that? I do think that we still need a dialogue around what's driving business, what's driving development. We still need to not necessarily jump into partnerships, but to understand each other's driving forces and collaborate. And I think that dialogue needs to be a bit more between three sectors. I've been initiating public-private. I've been criticized for not inviting, and this when I was heading SIDA in Sweden, criticized for not making room for civil society, private sector, and public sector in the same dialogue. I think we, based on what's happening here today, on top of what OECD can bring to the table, which is standards, we are going to measure the total official financial flows for development through the TOSD. We're going to create a global outlook on financial flows. That's very important to learn and to incentivize and measure. But what we can do more of is to convene and collaborate, to use this meeting and this place to be a platform for dialogue and action. But having said that, we don't want an ecosystem, or we want an ecosystem where initiatives are talking to each other, where the Global Commission on Sustainable Development is part of what we are doing, and we cannot afford to compete. So I want to see OECD DAC playing this role of incentivizing action, convening around the dialogues we need to take, but do that in collaboration with other platforms, be it the UN, be it the World Economic Forum, who knows the private sector better than many others. And let's work together when we convene these meetings. So there's things we can do.
Of course. Thank you very much. And you mentioned trust a couple of times. Trust came up in all of the sessions, I suspect. And trust is, I think, if the poll that you mentioned, 50%, not sure that public-private partnerships will work, that's an unfortunate figure. On the other hand, it's rooted in an unpleasant past for the way many people feel about the role that business has played in development. But I think that's changed. We heard a terrific talk this morning at the beginning from Alain Papias of BNP Paribas. And I wanted to ask Jeremy, this really comes right into your bailiwick. How did the Commission, Amy Giannassimi gave a good rundown of the report today, so I think people who were here understand that. But how did the Commission deal with this issue of trust, and how hard does that make it for the 35 CEOs in your group and the 1,000 CEOs you're trying to reach over the next year? I mean, what role does trust play, and how do you build trust with NGOs, with governments, and with people, with the whole of society?
That's a small question, Doug. Thank you. So a couple of things. There was a very important Edelman survey. It comes out every year on the trust barometer. And this year, of course, as it does every year, I'm sure this is part of Richard's business model, the trust barometer was even lower than in the previous year, right? Somehow it gets worse and worse, right? There must be a flaw to it somewhere. What was interesting was the following distinction. CEOs were not trusted, right? They were well beneath the 50% ratio. And it relates to things obviously to do with compensation and the drivers of that compensation. So their trust barometer in most countries, I mean, and again, one has to realize that we should be careful not to generalize. But in many countries it had gone down. The trust for business, and where that was described as a general category,
actually remained strong. Right? So there is, in many people's minds out there, at least in those surveyed by Edelman, a view that actually, on the whole, business does what it says it will do. You may or may not like it, right? But often trust is a matter of whether or not expectations are met. And so I think the starting point, which is that most businesses, and by the way, most businesses are not large corporates and multinationals, they are the SMEs, they are smallholder farms, right? There are many, but business actually doesn't have quite as negative a rap as you might imagine, is important. And so I'm going to at least begin with a kind of glass half full view, right? As opposed to assuming that business in general is distrusted. I think business can easily jettison the trust that it has. It doesn't take much, right? It takes, mis-selling. It takes faulty products. It takes, putting money above everything else. So for our 35 CEOs, the issue of trust is hugely important. The issue of doing the right thing in their business, and this is not just about, if you will, to shareholders, but to stakeholders more generally, is hugely important. When we insisted that there should be a very explicit mention of things like the UN guidelines on human rights and the OECD, everybody says that matters. We put in the executive summary the fact that there are hundreds of millions of underaged or children who are beneath 18 who are still working invisibly and unprotected to a large extent in global supply chains. We're all wearing clothes. We've all eaten chocolate over the last week. Probably everybody in this room from countries where child labour is at the heart of cocoa production. Don't kid yourself. We're all in the mix here. So I think that the business leaders on the Commission get all of that. I think that they believe that in order for business not only to retain trust but to build trust, they want to be part of a progressive agenda in which business is central to the delivery of the kind of society we want to see. We wrote the report, and Amy did a wonderful job presenting it today. We wrote a report which said there's a huge economic prize, $12 trillion. There are hundreds of millions, 380 million jobs at stake. There is the opportunity, if you will, to drive transformative change. We wrote that, in a sense, not for the 35 CEOs on the Commission, but for the 1,000 CEOs that we need to bring on board and to get them to see that there's a real prize. So I think, to your question, the thing that business needs to do in the matter of trust is to get on with pursuing those opportunities as best they can. Right? That is the most important thing for business to do. We believe that every business, but let me narrow it a bit. We believe that the 1,000 biggest businesses in the world all ought to have a board director who is going to take account for the SDGs. We believe that every company of size ought to at least have one major board session which says, how does our strategy line up with the world called the SDGs, not just for business reasons, although we think that just as Alain and others and Thomas described the business case for it, which we believe to be strong, there is also a moral and ethical case for it. It is absolutely fine to use the language of business ethics. It is not an oxymoron, right? So we should insist, we should help develop the field of business ethics and make it deeply, powerfully aligned to the SDGs. It is absolutely right for leading businesses to go into different communities, not just the investor community, and make it clear that they can describe what they're doing in terms of their business strategy and specifically in terms of their investment strategy. Because I can tell you, after my 25 years in McKinsey, And I think we should be clear. We shouldn't say he's now gone on to the bright side. I think that's partly where you can generate some distrust. I think, in all honesty, there are wonderful companies out there, and McKinsey is one of them, and people will have their own views. But the real point is that we want companies to go out there and explain how their investments, how the billions and trillions, companies will invest well over $10 trillion this year, how they're doing that, and why their investments, which will take years, if you will, to pay back fully, are consistent with an SDG view of the world. So that's what I think over time will generate trust. If I can make two final observations. I believe that we also need to recognize, and this is an observation for governments and an observation for business, and I'm sure I could make the same about civil society, but I'll stick to two for the time being. In the government realm of policy and institutions and conduct, we need to see in many countries, probably in all countries, a fundamental shift, right? The policies that we have are systematically, in almost every country, inconsistent with delivering the SDGs. You cannot deliver the SDGs with the energy policies we've got in most countries. We cannot deliver them with the agricultural policies we've got in most countries, the land use policies, the approach to water, you name it, the policies are not in shape to deliver the SDGs, right? So let's not kid ourselves. Business isn't going to suddenly deliver the SDGs without the right policies. I also don't think policies will be perfect. I spent many years at the World Bank before joining McKinsey. So we live in the world of the second best. Blended finance and catalytic finance can help in the world of what I will call the improving second best, right? If everything was perfect and was first best, we wouldn't need, but it's not, right? It's not. But blended finance cannot deliver in the third and fourth best. It's a waste of time. The private sector, the 10% of pension money, it will not go into the third and fourth best world. I promise you that. And if it goes, it will lose its shirt and it will look stupid and it will undermine this agenda. So there's a huge, not a small, but a huge change that's needed in the public side of this that goes from policies to institution, to conduct, to trust, to tackling corruption and all of that stuff. There's equally, if I turn the dial on to the other side, there is a huge change that needs to take place in the private sector. My 35 CEOs, even the 1,000, there's a progressive bunch out there, but there's a whole bunch of them that aren't so progressive, and let's not kid ourselves, right? And that view the purpose of business as making money, right? That's nonsense, right? And so there is a huge amount of work to be done there. It is often, and this is the very difficult political reality, it is often the incumbents in many sectors who make money out of policy distortions and out of the way things are, not the way things need to be, that will be resistant to the policy changes. And so one of our biggest messages that I think that I hope you take out of the work of the Business Commission is not just that there's a big prize, and not just that there are millions of jobs and all of these other things, all of which is true, but that real business leadership also involves taking on the responsibility to find ways to support governments that put the right policies in place. Because I can assure you that politicians of every stripe need support from their business leaders and from the investment community when they do the right thing, or as they're thinking about doing the right thing, getting help from that business world, as we saw at COP21 with We Mean Business and others, getting support from the business community on the fundamental shifts that are required on policies and institutions is essential to drive this change. And if you want there to be a critical partnership at the heart of the change, that relationship between business and government, not just in doing a project here and a project there as a public-private partnership, but in driving the deep changes that are required in policies, that will then allow markets to work properly in line with public interest, in line with social interest, in line with the SDGs. That is where the partnership needs to work at its very hardest.
Excellent. Charlotte, I can see you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the fact that private sector underestimates its role to advocate. You're talking about support. I'm also talking about private sector as a voice to put pressure on governments as well, and that it's underestimated. Private sector is so much more wanted than donors when they are for real. They are long-term, for self-interest perhaps, but they are there to stay. And if they put pressure, they can also make changes. So I think support/pressure is a role which is underestimated. I also think that we were urged today to do things differently by the Secretary General and Amina. The sense of urgency that we have 13 years left to deliver the SDGs. One of my worry is that we are talking about doing new things, blended finance, but at the same time, we need all the safeguards in place before we do things. That's not going to happen. I actually think that we need to create an atmosphere in which we talk bluntly that we need to do these new things because we need to deliver results. We haven't done them before. We might even install the wrong incentives, but we will check if in 2 years' time or something like that, if that's going to happen, and we will change. That way of working we never done. And my part of the equation of this sector is really risk-averse. And we cannot be risk-averse only if we're going to deliver on the SDGs. So we need to help each other in this.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, you mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer, and I saw that recent one too, and the number one concern among the people who were surveyed was corruption. And I think corruption gets to also one of the larger points you were making about the need to build trust with governments. I mean, it is a two-way street, and corruption is the obstacle to all progress. And so I wonder, I'd just like to kick this down to Pierre, if I may, and ask, at the Development Center, do you have discussions that are focused on corruption, on, implementing the OECD multinational enterprise guidelines or other elements of RBC? I mean, and what's the broader discussion like there?
Yes, well, I mentioned it in passing, but I'll say it more explicitly. The Development Centre does not cover all development policy. It has its specialties, its niche areas, and I think that it integrates well into the division's work. I made a reference to the fact that there is a dialogue on the management of natural resources, which is an initiative that at the end of 2015 led to the drafting of a kind of code of conduct, a kind of template contract, a model contract, essentially among mining companies of the north, the south countries, lawyers, NGOs, and so on. So through that dialogue, which concerned a particular sector, of course, the sector of the management of mining resources, of minerals, well, that led to a way of tackling corruption, but also a way of instituting good financial management to avoid Dutch disease, as it were. If we look at things only from the perspective of the fight against corruption, it seems to me that that is likely to be understood as work that relates to morals, ethical conduct, but it's not always convincing across the board. So I think you need to blend that perspective with the idea of good financial management to show that that corruption is not just an evil, it is also ineffective, it is inefficient. So I think that we combine those approaches. And with regard to corporate social responsibility, the guidelines for multinational enterprise have existed since 1976. They celebrated their 40th anniversary last year, but these guidelines have been renewed since the dreadful Rana Plaza catastrophe, and it's the organization, the OECD itself, which does this work, but there was also joint work undertaken with the Development Center of the OECD and certain international organizations with regard to specific sectors, particularly the agribusiness sector and textiles. So major work has been done in that regard. And once again, the distinctive characteristic of the Development Center is that it is a unique space where everybody can talk together without any hidden agendas. But the Development Center is not aiming to become a tool in the fight against corruption and nothing more than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just have another quick comment and see if the panel wants to comment on it, but then we'll see if there are any questions from the audience. Session 2 today, I think, had the wrong title from listening to the discussion and some of the assessments. The title was, How Can Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises Help Achieving the SDGs? From the conversation there, I think it should have been, the SDGs cannot be achieved without small and medium-sized enterprises. In so many countries, OECD countries and non-OECD countries, the SMEs are the prime drivers of jobs. And it takes me to another question, because a lot of SMEs employ or are run by women, and the same can be said for the informal economy. And in the sessions that I attended today, there wasn't a lot of talk about gender. And I was a little bit surprised. It came up in some discussion on the informal economy and the fact that women are the primary workers in many countries in the informal economy. And those are not, we all know, often the very best jobs. So I wonder if that's something that, Jeremy, when the Commission looked at business opportunities, you had 35 CEOs from big companies, and you're going to look at, you're going to try and promote this through 1,000 CEOs of the biggest companies, and I get that. But I wonder if there's a place there for SMEs, if there was in your conversation, and how you see pushing down some of these benefits to the SMEs.
Doug, just I think 3 comments. One is, I wonder whether we should think hard about the SME language, right? And whether it helps us or doesn't. I don't know. I worry that it's such a broad category that we end up going, well, that involves everything from your Silicon Valley startup through to your smallholder, in Botswana, and so I'm on a small mission to figure out whether there's actually a more powerful way of disaggregating that whole thing and talking about it in terms that I think could be more actionable at the end of the day. So it's not to criticize the point you're making, but I worry. So one consequence of that worry is that we decided that we would pick a number of segments within what you might regard as the SME world, right? I don't know how S it will be, right? But it will certainly be medium-sized enterprises. So there are 3 particular segments that we're going to reach out to, in addition to, if you will, the 1,000 biggest company thing. One is that we decided that we would make a very particular emphasis on sort of medium-sized family-owned businesses, particularly those that are now in their kind of second generation, third generation. We think that both in developed and developing countries, that this is a community of people that actually kind of get each other across geography and that have an intergenerational view of what they're trying to build, and that therefore are natural, if you will, mimetic carriers of the SDG idea. So we will particularly reach out to them. We will particularly reach out to women-led businesses. So we're going to try and see if we can get to some number, 500 or so, women-led businesses that we think can really, if you will, radiate the story of the SDGs and what they're doing. But as business leaders, it's probably, and I hope I'm not being sexist in making this observation, our instinct, which is that maybe women-led businesses get it more naturally than some of the men-led businesses. So, but someone can take me on that. And then the third thing that we're doing is that we're going to reach out to another segment that we think of as the kind of a bit more techie, millennial type led businesses. So younger entrepreneurs between 25 and 35. We're not going to reach every, but we're trying to take at least 200-300 of each of those segments across geographies and see if we can, working with others, working with the Compact, working with the B team, working with various others, begin to find, if you will, natural communities where there's shared kind of interpretations of the world and see if we can make them come to life and be powerful. So that's what we're trying to do.
That makes sense. And I know in listing the organizations you're working with, you inadvertently missed the OECD because we have had some good cooperation with the Commission. And we have some ongoing financing projects as well. And so that's excellent. Do we have some questions from the audience? Yes, I see one here in front. Do we have, here comes a microphone. If you'll stand up and tell us who you are and
Je vais parler français pour faire plaisir.
Yes, I'm going to speak French just for the ambassador's gratification. I'm Van der Koor. I am from Belgium, and I come often to this wonderful organization. I have been a minister of my country, the president of the National Assembly, and the day before yesterday, I celebrated the 49th anniversary of my election to Parliament. One thing that really struck me in the comments and the questions, I was surprised in the debate today, in which I remained silent, which is rare for me. I saw that there are some subjects that have not been mentioned. Security. We talked about trust, trust in governments, distrust, and so on. But what about security, safety? Encourage companies to or people to establish companies and then protect them, protect and safeguard the rule of law, provide appeals, for example, to international tribunals. Also, security in the formal sector, because sometimes there's a minority of companies that are formed in the formal sector as such. They need to have the safeguards and the safety to encourage them to formalize. I believe that Africa has changed a great deal, not just ideologically and politically. I do a lot of work with Central Africa, and we have conducted studies in this regard. There has been abuse of power, long-standing regime leaders. There have been instances of corruption that have been very striking. It seems to me that we have seen a lot of development in our countries in the West that we could transfer to those countries with regard to protecting democracy and the state of rule. There are 1.3 billion Africans. If we do not succeed in improving the conditions for these populations and making life livable in their home countries, they will be migrating to Europe. We have a moral duty to be generous, but we also have a duty to be protective and to try and solve these problems at the base.
Thank you very much for that statement. We certainly know well here at the OECD that you don't have development without security. But it's a difficult problem. We're talking about the SDGs, and I don't know quite how to answer that. I mean, we can't do world peace and the SDGs at the same time. Pierre?
Je crois que le ministre belge a...
Yes, I think that the Belgian minister is right. We didn't talk about these subjects, but in the SDGs, some of these issues are